For decades, we have been told to trust the unseen experts in the shadows of Washington. We were told that the whispers of the intelligence community were as solid as granite and as holy as the Constitution itself. But on one fateful morning, in a room filled with the heavy scent of old mahogany and political ambition, the curtain was finally pulled back. What we saw wasn't a pillar of truth, but a hollow shell of innuendo that had been used to weaponize the government against its own citizens. Tulsi Gabbard stood at the center of this storm, not as a partisan hack, but as a woman who has worn the uniform and knows exactly what real national security looks like. She didn't come to the hearing to play the usual games of deflection or political theater that have become the hallmark of the DC elite. Instead, she leaned into the fray with a calm that can only come from a clear conscience and a commitment to the American people. She didn't need to raise her voice because the truth resonates with its own frequency, one that cuts through the static of cable news. She asked a single question that was so simple and so direct that it left the most powerful men in the room scrambling for cover. It was a moment that every American who cares about the sanctity of our republic needs to witness from start to finish. I promise you that if you stay with me until the very end of this deep dive, you will see exactly where the evidence ended and where the propaganda began. You will understand how a narrative was crafted out of thin air to manipulate the highest office in our land and why they are so afraid of accountability today. We are going to peel back the layers of the FISA abuses, the suppressed evidence, and the calculated leaks that have stained our institutions. Before we go any further, I want to ask you to do something important for the future of this conversation. Please take a moment to drop a comment below, letting us know where you are watching from, and hit that subscribe button. The legacy media won't tell you this story, so we have to stick together to ensure the truth reaches every corner of this great nation. We are building a community of patriots who value facts over feelings and evidence over executive overreach. Now, let's look at the moment the shift began, where years of claims about Russian collusion and intelligence certainty started to collide in one room. It wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a collision between a documented record and a manufactured headline. When the cameras stopped rolling, a terrifying reality surfaced. There was total silence where the evidence was supposed to be. Adam Schiff, a man who has made a career out of claiming he has secret proof hidden in a vault, leaned toward his microphone with a practiced air of authority. He started by questioning Director Gabbard's judgment, citing her skepticism of intelligence assessments that he claimed were bipartisan and beyond reproach. He spoke about our allies and how they relied on these assessments, implying that any doubt was a betrayal of our global standing. It was the same old song we've heard for years. If you ask for proof, you are helping the enemy. Schiff's tone was sharp, accusing her of echoing narratives that conveniently aligned with the interests of foreign adversaries in the Kremlin. Gabbard sat there, unmoved by the weight of the accusations, allowing the room to feel the pressure of the silence she returned. Schiff continued his assault, suggesting that her skepticism crossed a line into something far more dangerous than mere policy disagreement. He spoke about patterns of behavior that warranted scrutiny, using the vague language that Washington bureaucrats use to smear people without actually making a formal charge. But Tulsi Gabbard isn't the typical Washington target, and she wasn't about to let a sitting senator hide behind the mask of concerns and susceptibility. She leaned forward, her eyes locked on his, and demanded a level of precision that is rarely seen on Capitol Hill. She asked him point blank if he was suggesting that she, the Director of National Intelligence, was compromised by a foreign power. The air in the room seemed to vanish in an instant as the weight of that question settled on everyone present. Schiff tried to smile it away, offering a weak clarification that her positions were merely useful to those foreign interests. But Gabbard wasn't looking for a dance. She was looking for a deposition, and she refused to let him retreat into the safety of semantics. She demanded he state the conclusion his patterns led him to, and requested he do it clearly and under the solemnity of his oath. What we witnessed next was a masterclass in the Washington crawl, as Schiff shifted in his chair and tried to pivot back to classified intelligence. He claimed the committee had seen things that justified his stance, but Gabbard interrupted him with the sharp precision of a surgical strike. She reminded him that as the DNI, she has access to the exact same material he does, and if there were evidence of her compromise, she would have seen it. She dared him to cite it, to name the report, to point to the page, but all Schiff could do was tap his pen and talk about sensitive sources. It was a glaring admission that the evidence he had touted on television for years was nothing more than a ghost. Gabbard made it clear that this wasn't about semantics. It was about the fundamental difference between oversight and innuendo. She called out the tactic of implying disloyalty without a shred of proof, a move that harkens back to some of the darkest chapters of our political history. Schiff tried to turn the tables by asking if she denied that her statements aligned with Russian narratives, but she was ready for that trap. She stated firmly that alignment of a viewpoint does not equal allegiance to a foreign power, and she denied that any intelligence existed to prove otherwise. The power in the room had shifted permanently, and everyone watching knew that the old guard was losing its grip. For years, Schiff and his allies had asked the American public to trust their implications and to believe in their secret evidence. But on this day, Gabbard asked them to stand by those implications under the threat of perjury, and the silence that followed was deafening. Schiff tried to regain his footing by bringing up the integrity of intelligence agencies, but Gabbard was quick to point out that integrity requires protection from weaponization. She wasn't just defending herself. She was defending the very idea that intelligence should be used for national security, not as a political bludgeon against domestic opponents. It was a stunning reversal of roles that left the committee in a state of shock. As we move into the deeper details of the Russia probe, I want to remind you why this matters to every one of us who believes in a fair justice system. If they can do this to a director of national intelligence, they can do it to any citizen who dares to question the establishment. We need your voice in this fight, so if you haven't already, please subscribe and share this video with someone who needs to see the truth. We are going to expose the timeline of the criminal conspiracy claims that Schiff fueled for 2 long years, despite knowing the facts didn't support them. This is the accountability the mainstream media refuses to provide, and it starts right here. Gabbard took the committee on a journey through the documented history of the special counsel's investigation, a report that found no conspiracy despite Schiff's repeated public assurances. She reminded the room that Schiff had gone on national television dozens of times, telling the American people he had direct evidence of a crime. When the report finally came out and showed a complete absence of such a conspiracy, there was no apology from the senator's office. Instead, there was a double down on the narrative, a move that Gabbard correctly identified as the difference between professional analysis and blatant propaganda. She held up the mirror to his career, and the reflection was one of calculated deception. The senator bristled at the mention of his past statements, trying to claim that the report documented extensive contacts that justified his suspicion. But Gabbard was relentless, pointing out that contacts are not crimes and that the public deserved the truth, not a curated version of it. She offered to read his own words back to him, the transcripts of his television appearances, where he claimed the evidence was hidden in plain sight. Schiff looked away, unable to face the reality of his own rhetoric when confronted with the cold, hard facts of the investigative record. The classification barrier he had used as a shield was being dismantled piece by piece. This is a pattern we see over and over again in the corridors of power. Imply a scandal, amplify it through a compliant media, and then retreat when the facts fail to materialize. Gabbard described this cycle with a clarity that resonated with every American who has felt lied to by their government. She argued that oversight requires accuracy, not just a louder microphone, and that repeated public certainty in the face of being wrong is a betrayal of the office. Schiff tried to frame her critique as an attack on oversight itself, but she countered that she was defending accountability. Without accuracy, oversight is just a political weapon used to punish enemies. The tension in the chamber reached a boiling point as they began to discuss the concept of good faith. Schiff claimed he acted in good faith based on the intelligence available, but Gabbard wasn't buying it. She argued that good faith doesn't excuse false certainty and that the public consequences of his words were too great to be brushed aside. The erosion of trust in our institutions didn't happen by accident. It happened because powerful people treated the truth as something that could be bent to suit a narrative. Every line of his defense was being stripped away, leaving behind a legacy of ambiguity and shattered credibility. As we continue to break down this historic confrontation, we are going to look at the FISA process and the documented errors that the elite tried to hide. You won't want to miss the part where we discuss the Hunter Biden laptop and the letter from the 51 intelligence officials that was used to interfere in an election. This is the evidence they wanted to bury, and we are bringing it back into the light. If you are finding this information valuable, please hit that like button right now. It helps the algorithm show this video to more people who are tired of being manipulated. Stay tuned, because the next segment is where the mask truly slips. Gabbard moved the conversation toward the FISA process, a topic that hits at the very heart of American civil liberties. Schiff tried to claim his memo from years ago showed there was no abuse, but Gabbard was armed with the Inspector General's report. She cited 17 significant inaccuracies and omissions in the surveillance applications targeting a U.S. citizen. Schiff tried to wave it off as mere errors rather than abuse, but Gabbard wouldn't let him off the hook. She pointed out that when those errors lead to the unlawful surveillance of an American, the intent matters much less than the devastating outcome for our constitutional rights. It was a moment of profound clarity for anyone who believes in the Fourth Amendment. Schiff's defense was that he was protecting confidence in the institutions, but Gabbard's question cut to the core, at the cost of truth. She accused him of defending institutions instead of correcting them, a fundamental failure of leadership that has led to a deep-seated skepticism among the American public. The memo that had once been Schiff's shield was now being presented as an exhibit of institutional denial. With each exchange, the pattern of putting the narrative above the facts became harder for anyone in that room to deny. TSN tip TICVVI 2000 T-tip Theo T2001 and 4000 Funne Sen Tin AP Trung Vao Ses DJ Trazung Quan Chic Laptop CA Hunter Biden VN BBY Ukraine Vakashma Kuk Chayan Jia Tun Bao Ji Thou Tung Trian Thang Ji Kanthip Thou Tin Tran Danchik Ca Enchi Simi Y. Video script Part 2 2001 to 4,000 words. The atmosphere in that hearing room grew even more stifling as the topic shifted to a piece of evidence that the DC establishment has tried to bury, burn, and forget for years. I'm talking, of course, about the Hunter Biden laptop story that was suppressed by the heavy hand of big tech and the calculated lies of the intelligence elite just weeks before a presidential election. Adam Schiff's expression tightened at the mere mention of it, instantly retreating to his favorite script, claiming the story bore the hallmarks of Russian disinformation. It is the ultimate irony that a man who constantly warns about threats to democracy was the primary architect of a narrative designed to shield a political candidate from the truth. Tulsi Gabbard didn't let him hide behind that tired, debunked phrase for a single second. She reminded him, and the American public watching at home, that Schiff himself had aggressively promoted a letter signed by 51 former intelligence officials. These experts used their credentials to tell you that the laptop was a Russian plant, yet they did so without seeing a single bit of evidence. It wasn't a professional judgment. It was a political hit job disguised as an intelligence assessment. When Gabbard pressed him on this, Schiff tried to claim it was just an opinion, but we all know how it was marketed to the media. Think about the gravity of what happened there. Our own intelligence apparatus was weaponized to silence a true story. The FBI had the laptop for months and had already authenticated it, yet the public was told it was a lie. Schiff was briefed on the reality of the situation, yet he continued to lead the country down a path of deception. This is the very definition of the deep state in action. A small circle of people deciding what you are allowed to know and when you are allowed to know it. If this doesn't chill you to the bone as a patriot who believes in free and fair elections, I don't know what will. Before we dive into the specifics of how they coordinated with the media to suppress this story, I have to ask, are you tired of the double standards in Washington? If you believe that the truth should belong to the people and not the bureaucrats, let us know in the comments by typing "truth over narratives." Also, if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time to join our growing community of Americans who refuse to be gaslit by the establishment. We are tracking the facts that the mainstream networks are too afraid to touch, and your support is what keeps this channel independent. Now, let's look at the pattern that Gabbard so brilliantly exposed during her questioning. She described it as imply, amplify, and then retreat. It is a tactical maneuver used to destroy reputations and influence outcomes without ever having to provide a shred of proof. Schiff admitted, under the pressure of Gabbard's scrutiny, that there was never any formal intelligence assessment labeling the laptop as Russian disinformation. Yet, he let the American public believe there was because it served his political interests at the most consequential moment of the election cycle. This wasn't just a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate blurring of the line between national security and partisan warfare. When Gabbard asked if any such assessment existed, the silence that followed was a confession in itself. The sequence of events is documented and undeniable, and as Gabbard pointed out, sequence matters in the world of intelligence and accountability. They use their titles and their classified access to manufacture a consensus that was a total fabrication. They gambled that you would be too trusting to ask for proof, and for a while, they were right. But the rules changed the moment someone with the same level of clearance and a spine of steel stood up and said, "Show me the records." Gabbard followed the thread of these selective leaks and calculated timings that always seemed to benefit one specific narrative. Schiff tried to claim these leaks were a media issue, but Gabbard hit back, noting that they frequently occurred right after closed-door hearings. It's a convenient system they built. Leak a distorted version of testimony to a friendly reporter, watch the headline go viral, and then hide behind classified rules when asked for the full context. The conversation then turned to the catalyst of the first impeachment, Ukraine. This is a chapter that many in D.C. want to keep closed, but the inconsistencies in Schiff's story are impossible to ignore. Schiff had previously denied coordination with the whistleblower, claiming he didn't even know their identity. However, the record eventually showed that his staff had indeed been in contact with that individual before the formal complaint was even filed. It was another case of first the denial, then the exposure, and finally the convenient clarification. Gabbard highlighted that these aren't just minor procedural hiccups. They are a direct assault on the credibility of the United States government. Each time the establishment is caught in a lie, they simply revise their story and move on to the next target. But the American people have noticed, and the erosion of trust is now a structural problem that a simple apology cannot fix. Schiff tried to frame his actions as being in the country's interest, but as we've seen, His version of the country's interest usually looks a lot like his own political survival. We are about to enter the most shocking part of this hearing, the discussion regarding the destruction of records from the January 6th committee. If you thought the suppression of the laptop was bad, wait until you hear how they handled the evidence that didn't fit their pre-written conclusions. They claim to be the guardians of democracy, yet they erased the very history they were supposed to preserve. Stay tuned, because we are going to expose exactly what happened to those files and why the truth was treated as expendable. Gabbard pointed out that while the committee released extensive findings, they did so selectively. They gave the public edited transcripts and testimony excerpts while withholding the full context that might have offered a different perspective. Most disturbingly, when the investigation concluded, some of those records were destroyed. Schiff claimed this was standard procedure, but Gabbard corrected him with the authority of someone who knows the law. You don't destroy evidence when future review is foreseeable and criminal referrals have been made. This is the ultimate betrayal of the public trust. By destroying the underlying evidence, they ensured that the official narrative could never be challenged or re-examined by the people. They curated a story, removed the dissent, and then told you it was the definitive account. It's a tactic straight out of an authoritarian handbook, not a representative republic. As Gabbard so powerfully stated, when the evidence disappears, the trust of the American people follows right behind it. Schiff sat there, attempting to defend the indefensible by saying the findings speak for themselves. But how can they speak for themselves when the alternatives were erased? Gabbard reminded him that truth requires transparency, not just a finality dictated by a political committee. This wasn't about accountability. It was about controlling the past to ensure they can control the future. And as the room fell silent, the weight of that realization began to settle on the shoulders of everyone present. I want to take a second here to remind you why we do this. The media won't show you these exchanges because they expose the very people who feed them their scoops. We are only able to bring you this level of detail because of viewers like you who support independent, conservative-leaning analysis. If you're still with me, hit that like button, and let's get this message out to the millions of Americans who are being kept in the dark. We are the ones who have to hold these people accountable, because they clearly won't do it themselves. The final minutes of this confrontation were perhaps the most telling of all. Schiff, realizing that his usual defenses were failing, tried to paint himself as a victim, claiming Gabbard was trying to violence him. But she was simply describing outcomes, the measurable, devastating impact of years of false certainty and weaponized intelligence. He spoke about protecting institutions, while she spoke about serving under them. It was a clash of worldviews, one that sees the system as a tool for power, and one that sees it as a sacred trust to be handled with restraint. Schiff actually had the audacity to ask what would happen if the public demanded certainty. Gabbard's response should be engraved on the walls of every office in D.C. Then leadership demands honesty, even when it's unsatisfying. That is the difference between a statesman and a politician. A politician tells you what you want to hear to get what they want. A leader tells you the truth because it's what you deserve. Schiff's inability to grasp this basic concept is exactly why our country is as divided as it is today. By the time the chair moved to close the session, the mask had not just slipped. It had been completely torn away. Schiff had been forced to admit, under oath, that he never had the direct evidence he had spent years promising the American people. He had to face the reality that his good faith was a hollow excuse for public consequences that have torn the fabric of our nation. Gabbard didn't just win a debate. She performed an autopsy on a decade of political manipulation. The silence that filled the room after Schiff's admission was not just a pause in a hearing. It was the sound of a 5-year-old narrative finally collapsing under its own weight. It wasn't ended by a flashy headline or a strategic leak, but by the cold, hard reality of a recorded session where the truth could no longer be avoided. Schiff tried one last desperate maneuver to frame the entire exchange as a mere unlucky interpretation of intelligence. But Gabbard remained steadfast, framing it instead as a deliberate and dangerous pattern of behavior that has cost this country its sense of unity. She made it clear that you cannot claim to be protecting institutions while you are simultaneously hollowing them out from the inside. Schiff's defense rested on the idea that the reality of intelligence work is inherently messy and that mistakes are part of the process. Gabbard, however, demanded an explanation for why these mistakes always seem to point in the same political direction. She asked how repeated public certainty can ever be acceptable when it is consistently proven wrong by subsequent investigations. Schiff retreated once again into the shadows of classified information, claiming his statements were informed by secrets he couldn't share. But Gabbard pointed out that while the raw data might be secret, the conclusions he chose to broadcast to the world were very much public. She reminded him that he didn't tell the American people he had suspicions or indicators. He told them he had evidence. Schiff tried to play word games, suggesting that evidence can be circumstantial, but the record was clear. He hadn't used the word circumstantial during his countless hours of cable news appearances. He had used the word direct. This wasn't a case of intelligence evolving, as Schiff tried to claim. It was a case of accountability finally catching up. The standard of probabilities stated as probabilities had been replaced by a standard of conclusions stated as weapons. If you are watching this and feeling a sense of righteous anger, you are not alone. This is exactly why we need to keep the pressure on our elected officials to return to a standard of absolute honesty. Before we move into the final analysis of this historic day, please make sure you've shared this video on your social media platforms. The more people who see these admissions, the harder it will be for the establishment to pull the wool over our eyes next time. Your engagement is the only thing that breaks through the censorship of the mainstream media machine. Gabbard's interrogation exposed a fundamental truth: that concern for national security should have standards. These standards exist specifically so that our intelligence capabilities are not used as a shield for political operations. Schiff complained that his credibility was being attacked, but Gabbard corrected him. She was simply examining it the same way he had examined others for years. He had built a career on the public's assumption that when a high-ranking official says, "I've seen the evidence," it actually exists. By admitting he didn't have it, he admitted to a betrayal of that sacred trust. The senator tried to pivot, calling the entire line of questioning a distraction. But the record is not a distraction. It is the foundation of our republic. He spoke of legitimate concerns within the intelligence community, yet he couldn't explain why those concerns were never sustained by any formal investigation. For years, he defended claims long after they had collapsed, and when they were finally debunked, there was no correction or apology. He had blurred the line between a real threat and a false claim. And in that blur, public trust began to erode. Gabbard sat back and delivered a final, stinging indictment of the Washington way of doing business. She noted that good faith does not excuse false certainty, and that hiding behind a classified label does not erase the public consequences of one's words. The room felt smaller as the authority and ambiguity that Schiff had relied on were stripped away line by line. The silence that followed was more powerful than any rebuttal could ever be, as it signaled the end of an era of unchecked implication. This hearing wasn't just about one senator or one director. It was about whether we will remain a country governed by facts or a country governed by narratives. Schiff's final attempts to move to something concrete only led him further into the trap of his own making. He tried to defend a FISA process that the Inspector General later confirmed was riddled with 17 significant inaccuracies. He tried to claim the intent was pure, but Gabbard reminded him that the outcome was the unlawful surveillance of a United States citizen. As the session drew to a close, the power in the room had shifted permanently. Schiff's final words, claiming he acted in the country's interest, rang hollow against the backdrop of the documented sequence of events. Intent does not negate impact, and the impact of these actions has been to divide a nation and degrade our most vital institutions. Gabbard held his gaze one last time, calling for a leadership defined not by what is common in Washington, but by what is honest. The American people deserve a government that respects their intelligence and preserves the evidence of its own actions. We cannot allow our history to be curated by those who wish to hide their own failures. As we move forward, let the memory of this hearing serve as a reminder that the truth is often found in the silences where evidence was supposed to be. It is up to us, the citizens, to ensure that those who seek to lead us are held to the highest standard of accountability. Thank you for staying with me through this deep dive into one of the most important confrontations in modern political history. I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think we will ever see a true apology from the DC elite? Or is this pattern here to stay? Leave a comment below, and let's keep this conversation going. If you found this analysis insightful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content that dares to tell the side of the story the networks won't. Together, we can restore a standard of truth and integrity to our great nation. The aftermath of that hearing didn't just stay within the halls of Congress. It rippled across the digital landscape of America like a lightning bolt. While the legacy media tried to bury the footage of Schiff's hesitation, the American people were busy sharing it in every corner of the internet. You could almost feel the collective intake of breath as citizens from Maine to California watched a man who had led them on for years finally run out of excuses. The short clips of the silence, the long, agonizing pauses where Schiff stared at his papers, became the most shared videos of the week. It wasn't just political junkies watching. It was everyday Americans who felt a deep sense of betrayal after being lied to about the very foundations of their democracy. On social media, the reaction fractured along the familiar lines of our divided nation, but with a new and striking difference. Even some of the most ardent supporters of the establishment found it difficult to defend the glaring absence of evidence that had just been admitted under oath. A quieter but more powerful response began to cut through the noise, a realization that the certainty we were sold was a product, not a fact. People replayed the exchange where Gabbard demanded he say it clearly and under oath, and they noticed what didn't follow. They noticed that for all the years of grandstanding, there was no proof to back up the accusations of foreign compromise. Inside the private offices of Washington, the panic was palpable as staffers scrambled to figure out how to reframe a disaster that had already gone viral. Schiff sat alone for moments longer than usual, perhaps realizing for the first time that his classified refuge had been breached by the simple truth. His aides hovered near the door, offering to issue statements or clarifications, but even they seemed to know that some things cannot be clarified away. Across town, Gabbard's team remained calm, knowing that they didn't need to spin the truth because the truth was doing the work for them. They knew that once the public sees the man behind the curtain, you can't just pull the curtain back. The evening commentators on the major networks did their best to distract the public by debating tone instead of the actual substance of the admissions. They called Gabbard confrontational and aggressive, while praising Schiff for being measured and restrained in the face of an attack. They focused on the fact that she crossed a line, but they completely ignored the fact that Schiff had avoided the truth for nearly half a decade. But the American people, especially those of us who have lived through enough history to recognize propaganda when we see it, weren't falling for it. We know that being measured is just another word for evasive when you're being asked for evidence you don't have. If you are watching this and you've seen this kind of media manipulation before, I want you to head to the comments right now and type, "We see through it." It's time we send a message to the talking heads that we are no longer interested in their curated versions of reality. We want the raw, unedited truth, and we want it delivered without the filter of DC bias. Also, make sure you hit that subscribe button if you want to stay informed on the stories the networks are trying to suppress. We are building a movement that values evidence over optics, and we need every patriot to stand with us in this fight. Days after the hearing, the footage was still circulating, but it had transitioned from breaking news into a permanent reference point for institutional trust. It was being replayed on podcasts, in late-night monologues, and cited in editorials as a definitive moment of political reckoning. The question, "Where is the evidence?" began to be asked in places that had relied on implication for far too long. It was appearing in interviews with other officials and in debates about the future of our intelligence oversight. The answer never came, but the expectation that it should begin to take a firm hold on the American consciousness. This is the part of the story that no one in Washington can control: the memory of the people. They can delete emails, they can destroy records, and they can edit transcripts, but they cannot erase what millions of Americans saw with their own eyes. The rules of the game changed in that hearing room because the demand for proof became public and undeniable. It wasn't about outrage anymore. It was about the cold, hard memory of a promise made and a promise broken. And that memory isn't going away, no matter how many times they try to change the subject. Let's talk about the legal implications of what was revealed regarding the FISA process and the Inspector General's findings. For years, we were told that any suggestion of spying on a political campaign was a crazy conspiracy theory that only lunatics would believe. But as Gabbard pointed out, those conspiracies were actually validated by the highest oversight authorities in the land. The 17 significant inaccuracies were not just clerical errors. They were the fuel for an unlawful surveillance operation against a U.S. citizen. Schiff's memo, which he used to reassure the public that everything was above board, was shown to be a total fabrication of the facts. The concept of good faith was used as shield by Schiff, but in the world of national security, good faith has to be backed up by a commitment to accuracy. You cannot claim to act in good faith while you are dismissing legitimate concerns and attacking those who raise them. Gabbard's point about institutional denial is perhaps the most important lesson from this entire ordeal. When institutions prioritize their own reputation over the truth, they stop serving the people and start serving themselves. This is how trust is eroded, and it is how a republic begins to crumble from within. The destruction of the January 6th committee records is another piece of this puzzle. That reveals a deep-seated fear of transparency. Why would a committee that claims to have found the definitive truth feel the need to erase the underlying evidence? If their findings were so solid, they should be able to withstand any amount of future scrutiny or re-examination. By removing the material that challenged their narrative, they admitted that their story was a fragile one that required protection from the light of day. It was an act of historical revisionism that should offend every American who values the integrity of our national record. Schiff's claim that there was no requirement to preserve everything indefinitely is a classic bureaucratic dodge. When you are making criminal referrals and changing the course of history, the requirement to preserve evidence is absolute. Gabbard's insistence that responsibility includes preservation is a standard that we must hold all our leaders to. Power without accountability is just tyranny by another name, and the erasure of records is the ultimate tool of those who wish to avoid being held responsible. We must demand that our history belongs to the public, not to the committee chairs who wish to edit it to their liking. As we move into the final chapters of this analysis, we are going to look at what this means for the future of the 2024 election and beyond. The weaponization of intelligence didn't stop with the Russia probe or the laptop. It is a tool that they are continuing to refine. We need to be vigilant and informed so that we don't fall for the next round of implications and secret proof. Stay with me, because we are going to outline exactly what you can do to ensure that the truth remains the standard in our country. This is about more than just a hearing. It's about the soul of our nation. Gabbard's closing remarks were a call to a higher standard of leadership, one that isn't defined by what is common in Washington. She challenged the idea that public service is inherently imperfect as an excuse for deliberate dishonesty. She stood for the idea that when trust is treated as expendable, the country becomes more divided and the government becomes less legitimate. It was a message that resonated with everyone who is tired of the excuses and the walkbacks that always come too late to matter. She reminded us that words carry weight, and that weight can either support the republic or crush it. The silence of Adam Schiff at the end of the session was the most eloquent part of his testimony. It was the silence of a man who realized that he could no longer sell certainty where doubt existed. It was the silence of a system that had been exposed for its lack of restraint and its hunger for political outcomes. As the microphones clicked off and the room emptied, that silence remained, echoing in the minds of everyone who witnessed it. The shift was permanent, and the record was now clear for all to see. The confirmation of Tulsi Gabbard as the Director of National Intelligence in early 2025 marked a seismic shift in the power dynamics of Washington. For those of us who have watched the intelligence community drift further away from its original mission, her arrival was a long-awaited signal that the era of bureaucratic make-work and political posturing might finally be coming to an end. In her confirmation hearings, the contrast between her vision and the old guard represented by Adam Schiff could not have been more stark. Schiff and his allies warned that her presence would cause a mass exodus of spy talent, but many patriots saw it differently. They saw an opportunity to return the ODNI to its lean, focused, and objective roots. It was a battle for the soul of the intelligence community, and for the first time in a decade, the side of transparency was gaining ground. Gabbard's background as a veteran and her willingness to leave the Democratic Party when it drifted too far left earned her the respect of millions of conservative Americans. She understood, perhaps better than anyone else in that room, that the world is a dangerous place where regime change interventions have often led to disaster. Her focus was not on manufacturing narratives to fit a political agenda, but on ensuring that the president and the American people receive raw, unvarnished truth. This commitment to objective intelligence is exactly what Adam Schiff had spent years trying to undermine with his talk of hallmarks and direct evidence that never materialized. The irony was palpable. The man who claimed to protect democracy was the one most threatened by a leader who actually valued its foundational principles of accountability. If you're glad to see a leader who puts the Constitution above the deep state playbooks, I want you to hit that like button right now to show your support for this new direction. We need to send a clear message that the American people are finished with the era of shadow government and weaponized leaks. Make sure you're subscribed so you can follow every step of this cleanup process as it unfolds in the coming months. We're not just reporting on the news. We're documenting the restoration of our republic's most vital institutions. Your support is what gives us the strength to keep digging where others are afraid to look. The Inspector General's reports have already begun to validate what many of us suspected during the dark years of the Russia investigation. These weren't just isolated incidents or clerical errors in the FISA process. They were widespread abuses of authority by the Department of Justice. Every single one of the 25 surveillance applications reviewed by the Inspector General contained inadequately supported facts or apparent errors. This is a staggering level of incompetence at best, and a coordinated effort to deceive the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court at worst. Schiff's repeated claims that the system was working perfectly were shown to be a total fabrication, designed to protect a process that was being used to target political opponents. As we look toward the future, the misuse of Section 702 and other surveillance authorities remains a critical concern for every citizen who values their Fourth Amendment rights. We've seen how these tools, intended to track foreign terrorists and adversaries, have been turned inward to sweep up the private communications of millions of Americans. The government collects these communications and stores them in databases that can be searched without a warrant, creating a backdoor surveillance system that bypasses constitutional safeguards. Intelligence leaders from the previous era seem to have forgotten that public trust is necessary for these agencies to operate effectively. By withholding information about bulk collection programs, they haven't just lost our trust, they've undermined the very security they claim to protect. The destruction of January 6th committee records fits perfectly into this broader pattern of institutional cover-ups and selective transparency. While the committee claimed to be providing a true accounting of events, their decision to delete files before a new majority could review them tells a much different story. Donald Trump and his allies have pointed to this destruction as proof that the committee was more interested in a political roadmap than a roadmap for justice. Even if the committee didn't delete all the evidence, the fact that any significant portion was removed or archived in a way that prevents public scrutiny is a betrayal of the transparency they preached. It was a curated narrative from the start, designed to reach a predetermined conclusion while erasing the material that challenged it. For the millions of Americans over the age of 50, this loss of institutional integrity hits especially hard because we remember a time when the government at least pretended to respect the boundaries of power. Our generation has seen how the aggrandizement of executive authority and political polarization can lead to democratic backsliding and the erosion of our fundamental liberties. We know that the specialists on violence within the intelligence community should never be the most powerful group in our society. When they begin to permeate the civilian sphere and sideline democratic processes, the garrison state that Madison warned us about becomes a terrifying reality. This is why the confrontation between Gabbard and Schiff was so much more than a political debate. It was a defense of the civilian-led republic against a rising security state. We are seeing a growing movement of next-generation conservatives who, while weary of social welfare programs, are deeply committed to the individualistic and business-oriented values that built this country. They, like us, are becoming increasingly skeptical of a government that uses its power to pick winners and losers in the information environment. The narrative proximity between the people's desire for truth and a party's commitment to providing it is becoming the strongest predictor of voter behavior. People are voting for the story that matches their lived experience of seeing the establishment fail them time and again. And the story being told by leaders like Tulsi Gabbard of accountability, restraint, and honesty is one that is resonating with patriots of all ages. The Imply and Amplify tactic that Schiff perfected has finally run its course because the public has developed an immunity to its effects. We've seen the scoops that turn out to be nothing and the classified evidence that never sees the light of day. We've learned that when an official says, "I believe the intelligence points in that direction," what they're really saying is, "I want you to believe what I can't prove." The shift toward memory and accountability is the only way to heal the deep divisions that have been fueled by years of institutional dishonesty. We must continue to demand that our leaders state their conclusions as probabilities when they lack perfect certainty. As we move into the final stretch of this video, I want to talk about how you can stay active and involved in the fight to reclaim our institutions. The establishment thrives on apathy and our willingness to forget their past failures. We have to be the ones who keep the record, who share the clips, and who remind our neighbors of what was admitted under oath. Stay tuned, because the final summary will give you the tools you need to be an effective advocate for truth in your own community. This is our country, and it's time we started acting like we own it. As we stand at this pivotal crossroads in 2025, the lessons of the past decade have never been clearer or more urgent. We have seen what happens when the specialists on violence and the architects of narrative control are allowed to operate without the leash of transparency. The confrontation between Tulsi Gabbard and Adam Schiff was not merely a moment of high drama. It was a necessary cleansing of the American political soul. It revealed that while institutions can be corrupted and records can be destroyed, the fundamental human desire for truth is a force that no bureaucracy can ever truly extinguish. The era of blindly trusting the shadows of Washington is over, replaced by a new generation of patriots who demand that their leaders earn trust through every word and every action. The historical pattern of government overreach, from the false claims of WMDs in Iraq to the systematic failures in Afghanistan, has taught us that silence is often where the most dangerous lies are hidden. We were told to trust the intelligence consensus then, just as we were told to trust the consensus on the Hunter Biden laptop and the Russia collusion narrative. But as Director Gabbard so pointedly noted, when intelligence is used to shape political outcomes rather than inform national security, it ceases to be a service and becomes a weapon. The misuse of FISA against American citizens like Carter Page stands as a haunting reminder that even our most sacred constitutional protections can be suspended if we remain silent. We must return the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act to its original purpose, surveilling foreign agents, not the American people. Today, we are seeing a historic effort to identify and correct the past misconduct related to the weaponization of the federal government. A new policy is taking hold, one that requires a comprehensive review of all activities within the intelligence community over the last 4 years to root out instances of political bias. This isn't about revenge. It's about the restoration of a government that serves all its people, regardless of their political beliefs. We are moving toward a system where investigations into parents at school board meetings or individuals posting political memes are recognized as the abuses they truly are. The Attorney General and the Director of National Intelligence are now tasked with ensuring that law enforcement is never again used as a tool of partisan retaliation. The crisis of trust that has plagued our nation is beginning to show signs of healing, but only because we have finally started to name the problem. In 2024, only a fraction of Republicans trusted the federal government, but by 2025, that number has begun to climb as accountability measures take hold. Americans are no longer satisfied with walkbacks that come years after the damage is done. They want leaders who stand by their words under oath. The shift in public attitudes confirms that while we value the vital work of intelligence agencies, we will no longer tolerate them as a threat to our civil liberties. We are reclaiming the shared public sphere by refusing to inhabit different realities manufactured by those in power. I want to thank you for being part of this journey into the truth behind the headlines. If you've made it this far, it's because you care about the future of this republic and you're willing to look past the optics to the evidence. Please take a final moment to share this video with one person who might still be trapped in the old narratives. Your personal recommendation is the most powerful weapon we have against the curated consensus of the legacy media. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and turn on notifications so you can stay informed as we continue to track the dismantling of the weaponized state. We are just getting started, and your voice is essential to the success of this mission. The future of Section 702 and the broader FISA framework will be decided in the coming months, and we must remain vigilant. There is a bipartisan effort to ensure that the government can no longer search the electronic communications of Americans without a warrant. We must demand that any reauthorization includes significant safeguards and a narrowed scope for data collection. The era of backdoor surveillance must end, and the Fourth Amendment must be restored to its full strength in the digital age. This is the only way to ensure that the patterns exposed by Director Gabbard never become the standard operating procedure for our government again. As the cameras of history look back on this time, let them record that we were the generation that refused to let the truth be erased. Let them record that we demanded accountability, even when it was inconvenient for those in power. The silence that once filled the hearing room has been replaced by the voices of millions of Americans who are no longer afraid to ask the direct questions. We are the guardians of our own democracy, and our memory is the most potent defense we have against the return of the shadow government. Thank you for watching, and stay focused on the truth, because the truth is the only thing that can truly set us free. Now, I have one last question for you to leave in the comments. What is the single most important reform you want to see in the intelligence community this year? Is it FISA reform, the removal of political appointees, or a total declassification of past records? Let's build a list of priorities that our representatives cannot ignore. Together, we are turning the page on a decade of deception and writing a new chapter for America. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.